Ladies and gentlemen, what we've seen today is we've seen a side proposition that really doesn't understand the importance of influence inside democracy. Now what we mean by this is that in a democracy, influence is of importance to make sure that voters really understand exactly who they're voting for. And this is exactly what side opposition would really like to look at today. It's the importance of influence and how side oppositions try to make it seem like influence is really not beneficial to our society, but in the end, influence is exactly what drives the democratic process. Now before I start, I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm going to be doing today's speech today. First thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing a quick check of what side propositions brought up to you today and showing you why they really don't understand the importance of democracy and how it really works. And the second thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be moving into my own constructive speech, where I'll be moving into explaining exactly why allowing religious leaders to endorse political candidates is really effective to allow more voter representation. Now, the first thing side proposition has come up here today, and what they've really focused on is this idea of influence, and how these religious leaders have way too much influence over these other people that are part of their religion. Now, what we see today is that lots of people hold influence over other people. We see people like Oprah, who during the 2008 Obama campaign, what they did is they endorsed the candidates. And what we see is that these people, although they may not be religious, what they do is they have the influence over these people, which eventually causes voter turnout to actually decide to vote on these people. Now what this means is that in the end, this influence is actually beneficial to society, which is something I'm going to be covering a little later in my speech. Because in the end, what's happening right now is that these influential people have the ability to influence their people purely because of the fact that the people under them have bought into their system. Now, another thing this side proposition really talked about is this idea of impaired judgment. And what this means is they're trying to say that purely because of the fact that a candidate may be religious and their religious leader endorsed them, then a person will go and vote on it. And what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is a perfectly fair thing to happen. When a religious leader endorses a political candidate that is of the same religion or even of a different religion, what happens is that the people are influenced. And this is actually a good thing, because in the end, impaired judgment is going to happen in society, but what it does lead to is the fact that they will follow who they decide to lead. And what this means is that if we look at a system where the religious leaders do in fact endorse political candidates, what will happen is that these people will follow along the same track, which is perfectly fine, and side proposition hasn't shown you exactly why following along your own religious track is a big problem. And finally, they talked about this idea of minorities, and how the minorities are not being fairly represented within a democracy. And what we do see, ladies and gentlemen, is that in a democracy, the point of a democracy is to represent the majority of views. Now we do agree that in a Western liberal democracy, we value minorities. But the thing is, because of the fact that our countries are secularist, what eventually happens is because of that fact, politics and religion don't mix. And once a candidate is elected, religion doesn't play a big factor in a political decision. What we want to say, though, is the purely fact that once he gets elected, if it's because of religion, that's a perfectly fair argument for a voter to make. Now this really leads me into my three main constructive points of today's debate, which I'll be covering today. The first one we're going to be calling is influence, not religion. The second thing we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about this idea of encourages democracy. And the third thing we're going to be talking about today is the idea of secularism and how it plays a part in our society. Now, on our first point of influence, not religion, this really goes back to the first idea. The side proposition is trying to frame these religious leaders for being really bad because they have all this influence over their people. What we see is that there's so many public figures within our society that have influence, and they use this influence to endorse political candidates. Wouldn't you agree?
But would you not say that under the status quo, we've actually taken steps to limit the power that those institutions have over voters, but the church is not checked?
Well, thank you. What we see is that in those examples, what happens is that the church is still in check. It's not like the church can actually get into the political system without any other views. What we do see, though, is that because our country is a majority of Catholic voters, what eventually this means that we will elect a Catholic leader purely because it represents the majority of views within our country. Now, we don't see this as a problem, and side propositions try to make it seem like purely because we're representing majority of views is a huge problem. But really, this is what democracy really comes back to. It comes back to this whole idea of even though there are minorities, the fact is that the government is meant to represent the ideas of the majority. And this really comes back into my second constructive point, which is going to be talking about encourages democracy. Now what we see right now in today's society is that there's lots of low voter turnout throughout our country. Now what this means is that in many places, around 40% of voters only turn out. And we see this as a huge problem. A lot of problems are associated with a low voter turnout. And what we really see is that actually many of the times it comes down to the simple fact of all the political rhetoric that flies around different groups. And what this means is that voters don't actually know who to vote upon purely because of the fact that they don't get enough of the facts. Now what they count upon in these circumstances is the influential people. They count upon their role models to decide to endorse political candidates. Because when their role models endorse political candidates, what eventually happens is they believe they should follow that same path, therefore voting for that person. So it really makes the political system more effective because by getting more people to vote, what we're doing is we're helping move forward democracy because of the more representation. And in the end, our democracy needs the more representation purely because of the fact that we require more voters to come out and show their opinions. And as my partner will later expand in her constructive speech, we're also going to talk about the idea of secularism. Thank you.